Okay, so personally, if I were taking this exam, I would probably choose to do it on the computer just because I know for a fact that I can write down my thoughts a lot faster when I'm typing, especially if I can tab around. And then later on, I know for a fact that I tend to kind of write, you know, potentially crappy code. And then as I go through the problem statement, I can go back and easily edit it. So personally, for me, it's going to work a lot better if I do it on an IDE or something like Notepad++. Things like Word and Google Docs, those can be great and safe. However, the only issue with those is the fact that they autocorrect and, the formatting may be annoying. And so for me personally, I know that the auto formatting is going to annoy me too much. The auto suggest, all the underlines, that's gonna get annoying for me, and then I'm gonna be tempted to try and um, make it ignore all of those corrections that it's trying to do. And so I would definitely have the problem open on one screen, and then hopefully there's a timer that I can see at all times. If you are doing this by hand, please make sure that you have a way to kind of remind yourself that this is a timed exam. If you don't have a file uploaded or an answer copy pasted and submitted, you will lose all of the points. You won't get any credit. So you want to make sure you leave enough time to submit your answer. So as I'm reading through this, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to go in Eclipse and I'm just going to set up a blank project ready to go before the exam even starts, right? I'm just going to do file, new Java project, exam day project. Um, just a place for me to put all of my stuff for that exam. And then as I'm ready, I'm just going to create a new class and then I'll just go ahead and call it test. It really doesn't matter, right? I can even include a main method if I wanted to, maybe if I had time to test, but I'm not going to be tempted to kind of test my code. I just really want Eclipse to do the formatting and the typing for me so that it can make my thought process much faster. So I'm going to zoom in here. So for Windows, it's Control plus plus. And so now I'm going to read through it. So the Gizmo class represents gadgets that people purchase. Some Gizmo objects are electronic and others are not. A partial definition of Gizmo is provided below. So this is a very simple class. It has all these getters, right? And then the last thing that it has is this equals helper method that just compares two Gizmo objects, if I had to guess, to see if they are equal. And then, of course, typically on the AP exams, they're going to tell you, okay, we don't need to show you the constructor, just assume there is one. And then typically, whenever they don't talk about constructors at all, that means there probably won't be any need for you to create those types of objects. So now there's another class, right? This is very typical of ArrayList problems where we know that ArrayList stores objects, and so it makes sense for them to kind of create a class that has an ArrayList, and then that ArrayList uses another class, which is going to be essentially what we have here. We have Online Purchase Manager, which has an ArrayList of Gizmo objects. And so in order for you to kind of process this information, you really need to know what it means to be a gizmo. And so that's why they give you the partial implementation, because that's really all you need to know to work through the problem. Okay, so then as you walk through, you kind of, again, you just take a quick glance at it. There are two methods. Looks like they're instance methods, right? There's no static keyword. And one is to be done in part A and the other one is to be done in part B. So I always like to look at the method header, because I know if I know that I'm going to be writing part A, I can now copy this um, and put it in my Eclipse, because we know that this is going to be part A. So part A. The thing you do want to do is put your, you got to put your AP ID up here, and then potentially name whatever identification you need to give them. Make sure that you have it at the very top. So I'm going to go ahead and zoom out. So here I am, right? So I know that for this one, it tells me to count some stuff, okay? That's very typical again. So traversing an array list, that is a very common thing to do when it comes to just data structures in general, right? So visiting the elements, are you able to visit elements? Are you able to manipulate stuff in an array list? Are you able to access those objects? Very common operations. So we know that I'm going to be counting. What I'm counting is the number of gizmos in that list that are electronic, as well as made by the maker, right? So every gizmo object has some sort of electronic instance variable that keeps track of whether or not it is electronic. And then it does have a manufacturer called a maker. And so what we're doing is we are looking for all of the gizmo objects from the maker, from the manufacturer maker, and we are counting how many of them are electronics. So one, they have to be electronic. Two, they have to be manufactured by the maker, which is passed in as a string. So now they add another layer, which is string comparisons. First thing I need to know, or I need them to know, is that I know how to use my counting variables, right? So if you're going to count something, typical count, you just need a simple integer variable. Int count is equal to 0. And then I can already, in the end, I know that I'm going to return the count eventually. So for methods, right? Method headers tell you if you need to return data. So here it says that the count electronics by maker method returns an int. So I am ahead of time returning my count, whatever it may be. So now here I'm going to determine the count. Determine the count. So I can do that by visiting every single Gizmo object in the purchases array list. So remember that this is inside of the online purchases class. And so I know that I have access to that list. If it's going to bug you that you don't have it, so this is where you guys are going to run into syntax errors. And this is where potentially Eclipse is going to stop working for you. And so you just have to ignore it and know that you're using Eclipse to format your code and get it visually appealing to you so that you can trace your own code. It should not be your goal to make it runnable. You just won't have enough time for that. And if you do that, you could potentially fall into just a bug hunting 20-minute, 30-minute ordeal. So now I'm going to go ahead and traverse my list. So this is a very typical loop for int I equals 0, I is less than purchases that size I plus plus. So that for loop is going to generate all the possible indexes that will be used to visit the list. So now I could introduce a intermediate variable, or I could just directly access using the get method, which I'll just go ahead and do that. I'm just going to go and do if purchases.get I. So when I do get I, we know that I'm going to get a Gizmo object. And every Gizmo object has a get maker helper method. And I can then compare this with the manufacturer that I'm interested in, which is passed in as a parameter, right? So that's the data that this method needs. And so my job is to search through the entire list, find all the gizmos whose manufacturer equals the one that is passed in, And if that is the case, I can then increment my count, but only if it is an electronic device. So this is what I mean by, as you are doing this, you could, right? You could make decisions here and there to add extra variables that you need. And this is the beauty of doing it electronically, so that the editing process while you're solving the problem is much easier. So I'm going to go ahead and create a Gizmo object here. Gizmo, um, this Gizmo is equal to purchases.getI. And the reason I'm doing this is because I'm realizing as I'm doing the problem, which will happen to you on the actual test, that that line of code is going to be too long, and I just don't like that personally, because it's easier for me to read this, right? So now I can do if this gizmo dot get maker dot equals maker, and it has to be electronic. If this gizmo dot, so this is going to happen. You're going to go and say, okay, oh, what was that helper method? I'm showing you exactly what you could potentially be doing on the actual test, right? So there is the method called is electronic. So I wasn't sure what it was called, and so I just scroll up and down. So there you go. Visit, grab a gizmo object from index I, check to see if its manufacturer is equal to the one that is passed into the parameter method parameter. And then I want to check to make sure that in order for me to count this, to increment count, it has to be electronic as well. So if those two conditions are met, then I can increment my count. So I think that's it for that one. So again, typical thing that you might do for anything dealing with arrays or array list. Okay, so now let's go ahead and do part B. So then part B is down here. When purchasing items online, users occasionally purchase two things rapidly in succession without intending to do so. And so now we're writing a method called hasAdjacentPair, which detects if two adjacent Gizmo objects in purchases are equivalent. Okay, so now I'm going to grab that method header and I'm going to paste it here. Notice how I do have errors in my code, but don't let that distract you from reading through the problem and completing the prompts. We know that this will not run unless I have all of those classes all together, including any methods that they mention that I'm using. But I'm not going to make it runnable, and I'm going to resist any temptation of trying to make it do that. So it has adjacent pairs. So for this one, really all you want to do is take a look at two elements within a list at a time. So typically you guys will go from I to I plus 1, right? So you're looking at the object at index I, and then you're also comparing it to the object at I plus 1. So to me, if I need to compare all adjacent pairs, it triggers the need for a loop. So I'm going to do that. For int I is equal to 0, I is less than purchases dot size minus 1, I plus plus. So we've done this all year, where if you are going to look ahead at I plus 1, I plus 2, you want to make sure that you end your loop earlier such that the index is not going to cause any out of bound exception. Because I'm going to be referring to I plus 1, I want to make sure that I never refer to I being at the very end of my list. So that's why I have to add I minus 1 there. And so now I'm going to go ahead and check for two things. So I'm going to go if purchases dot get I. So we know that this is going to grab an object, but I need to compare two objects. Remember, you don't want to use any double equality if you're comparing objects typically, unless your intention was to just check that they're pointing to the same object. But for the AP exam, typically that's not what they're going to ask you to do. So it looks like there is a helper method called equals, which checks to see if two Gizmo objects are equivalent. And so that's what I'm going to use. I'm going to get the Gizmo at I, and then I'm going to check it and compare it with the Gizmo at I plus 1. Now, if I wanted to make this a little bit neater, I could go Gizmo A is equal to purchases that get I. And then I can simply copy paste, right? And then I could do I plus 1 here. So now this line of code can be a little bit less cryptic, and then I can see now that for sure I am checking to see if Gizmo A is equal to Gizmo B. If it is, so that means if I'm checking at location I and I plus 1, those are equivalent. Those are adjacent pairs. If they're ever equal to each other, I have to automatically return false. As soon as you find a pair that doesn't meet the requirement, you know you can return early. And so that's why we can return false there. If we ever make it out of the loop without returning false, then that means the loop will have compared all adjacent pairs and it didn't find any that met this requirement. So therefore it returns true. Perfect. The other thing that you may choose to do is include a variable, something like boolean has adjacent pair equals false, right? As soon as you find two adjacent pairs that are equal, then you could potentially set that to true and then work with that variable. But here I'm keeping it simple, keeping my code short. All right, so there goes part A and part B. I'm gonna go label this part B. And now I'm gonna look at part C. Part C says, how can you modify the method from part B if you wanted to check that there are no two equal Gizmo objects from the purchases whatsoever? In other words, the purchases list only has unique Gizmo objects without repeats. So part B only checks adjacent pairs. If you want to generate all possible pairs, then you typically use a double for loop, right? So that's what we're going to talk about here, part C. To modify part B so that it checks all possible duplicates, a nested loop is required to generate all possible pairs. The outer loop goes from I equals 0, 0 to I equals, I don't know, length minus 1. The inner loop will go from j equals I plus 1 to the length of the array. So that's typically what you would do if you were trying to generate all possible pairs. And that would also prevent any need to check if you're trying to check that you are generating a pair of objects with itself. So you never want I and j to be equal to each other, because then you're checking if an object is equal to itself. And so that's it. So again, as you notice, I am not correcting any of the compile errors. I'm not going to even check for spelling or anything like that, as long as I know I reread the problem statements a little bit if I have time, and I can reread my answer to make sure it's decently there. But I want to make sure that part A and part B are both done first, right? So you definitely want to prioritize completing the code versus completing that open-ended question. The reason for that is because we are not sure how that part is going to be graded and how much it's weighted. And so at this point, if you are struggling with time, you want to make sure that you're completing the parts of the problem that you practice all year. So you definitely want to for that to be solid. And then the last thing is submit way before time expires. You never want to just submit 10 seconds before the timer is done, right? So you want to click submit ASAP. So this is the part where you're just going to highlight and copy, and then you would then paste it into the College Board interface. And that's it. So that's the Gizmo problem. Hopefully that one was, a typical array list problem. Again, sometimes you have to create array list. So make sure you know how to do that. You definitely want to be familiar with traversing array list. And then just because they throw an integer at you or a class, right? Objects to be stored, or at least, well, integers are also objects, right? But just in case they throw in their own class, make sure that you are able to read through their typically simple descriptions for that class and just, don't get stuck reading every single word, just scan it. Just if you see a getter, there you go. There's a getter for maker. There's a getter for is electronic. Um, so you never want to sit there and just like read through word for word. You are familiar with all the parts of a class, and so don't let that distract you from how simple those methods are. A getter is just a getter, right? A getter for instance variables. Um, so there you go. I'll go ahead and talk about the next one, which is check digit. Stay tuned.